As she clears away the rotting timbers, what Eleanor discovers beneath the floorboards leaves her speechless and changes not just her future, but reshapes our understanding of American history itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Wright had never imagined her life would come to this, standing alone in the bitter November wind, watching as the demolition crew prepared to tear down the last significant structure on her family's once thriving Kentucky farm. At 57, with silver threading through her dark hair and determination etched in the lines around her eyes, Eleanor embodied both fragility and surprising strength. Just 18 months earlier, her husband James had passed away suddenly from a heart attack, leaving behind not just a grieving widow, but a financial nightmare that had been carefully hidden from her throughout their 30-year marriage. "Mrs. Wright, we're ready when you are," called Hector Ramirez, the sympathetic contractor who had agreed to handle the barn demolition at a reduced rate. "Though I still think this old beauty might be worth saving." He ran a weathered hand along the barn's exterior boards, their deep burgundy paint peeling to reveal the silver-grey wood beneath. Eleanor shook her head, pulling her worn cardigan tighter against the chill. "The bank doesn't see it that way, Hector, and neither does my empty checking account." Her voice carried a pragmatism that had become her armor since discovering James had remortgaged their property repeatedly to cover failed investments and mounting gambling debts. The sprawling 175-acre Wright farm had been in James's family since 1858, nestled in the rolling hills of Boone County with its rich soil and spring-fed streams. The property had once been the envy of neighboring farms, with its productive cornfields, prized heritage apple orchards, and the magnificent pre-Civil War barn that now awaited destruction. In its heyday, the Wright farm had employed dozens of local workers and was known throughout the region for its award-winning thoroughbred horses. The centerpiece of the property had always been the enormous timber frame barn, built in 1859 according to family law. Standing nearly 40 feet tall at its ridge, with hand-hewn oak beams and intricate joinery that had survived over 160 years of Kentucky's punishing weather, the structure represented craftsmanship rarely seen in modern construction. Local historical societies had approached Eleanor multiple times about preservation efforts, but with $427,000 in hidden debt and the bank's foreclosure deadline looming just 6 weeks away, sentiment was a luxury she could no longer afford. Eleanor had exhausted every possibility to save the farm. Refinancing applications denied due to her lack of income, potential investors backing away when they reviewed the property's financial realities, even desperate online fundraising campaigns that had generated more sympathetic comments than actual dollars. The timber in the ancient barn represented her last hope. A specialty reclaimed lumber company had offered $42,000 for the hand-hewn beams and weathered siding, enough to perhaps secure a modest apartment in nearby Burlington and give her a few months' breathing room to rebuild her shattered life. "I'm selling the past to buy a future," Eleanor had explained to her concerned daughter Amelia during their weekly video call. Amelia, an army captain currently stationed overseas in Germany, had offered to request compassionate reassignment. But Eleanor had refused. "Your father created this mess over decades. You can't fix it by derailing your career." As the demolition crew made final preparations, Eleanor's mind drifted to happier times. Summer barbecues in the barn's wide doorway, her daughter's 16th birthday party with twinkling lights strung across the soaring ceiling, the impromptu bluegrass concerts James would organize with local musicians. The barn had been the heart of their family life, And now it would be dismantled board by board, becoming reclaimed flooring or decorative ceiling beams in luxury homes whose owners would never know the history embedded in the grain. "Mrs. Wright," Hector's voice pulled her back to the painful present. "We found something odd in our preliminary work yesterday. Might want to take a look before we start the major teardown." Curious despite her weariness, Eleanor followed the contractor into the cavernous interior of the barn. The space, once filled with horses, equipment, and vibrant activity, now echoed hollowly with their footsteps. Hector led her toward the back corner, where his team had already removed some of the floorboards to inspect the foundation. "See these?" he asked, pointing to the exposed joists. "This section is different. Newer wood, probably replaced sometime in the 1920s or 30s, but what's strange is the pattern underneath." He shone his flashlight into the gap, illuminating what appeared to be a grid of brick supports, unlike the stone foundation visible elsewhere. "Is it a problem for the demolition?" Eleanor asked, peering into the darkness. "No, ma'am, just unusual. Most barns this age have consistent foundation structures. This looks," he hesitated, "deliberately engineered, different from the rest." Eleanor felt a flicker of curiosity penetrate her grief-exhausted mind. "Can we look closer?" Hector nodded to his crew, who quickly expanded the opening in the floorboards. As more of the substructure became visible, the oddity became unmistakable. Beneath this section of the barn was what appeared to be a carefully constructed brick chamber, approximately 12 feet square, with what looked like a narrow passageway extending from one side. "That's not normal," breathed Eleanor, her financial worries momentarily forgotten. "No, ma'am, it's not," agreed Hector. "In my 27 years of construction, I've never seen anything like this under a barn." For the first time in months, Eleanor felt something besides grief and anxiety, genuine curiosity. "Hector, could your crew expose more of this before we commit to the full demolition? I need to understand what we're looking at." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The contractor nodded, seeing the spark of interest that had been absent from his client's eyes during their previous interactions. "We'll be careful, Mrs. Wright. Might have some historical significance." By mid-afternoon, the crew had removed a significant section of flooring, revealing a remarkable sight. The brick chamber was unmistakably man-made, with carefully mortared walls and what appeared to be a deliberate entrance hidden beneath generations of Wright family barn flooring. More intriguing still was a set of worn stone steps descending into darkness. "It's definitely not just a root cellar," observed Hector, his professional interest thoroughly piqued. "Too sophisticated, too deliberately concealed." Eleanor stood at the edge of the opening, staring down into what felt increasingly like a chapter of her property's history that had somehow been erased from family records. "Could it be—" she began, but couldn't bring herself to complete the thought that had suddenly sprung to mind. Hector voiced it for her. "An underground railroad station? The timing would fit. This barn was built just before the Civil War, right?" Eleanor nodded slowly, remembering family stories about her husband's great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel Wright, who had purchased the land in 1858. The family narrative had always portrayed him as a successful farmer and businessman who'd moved from Virginia to establish a new branch of the family in Kentucky. But there had never been any mention of abolitionist activities or secret chambers beneath the barn. "I need to see what's down there," Eleanor decided, her voice firmer than it had been in months. "Mrs. Wright, I don't think that's safe without a proper—" But Eleanor had already grabbed the contractor's flashlight and was carefully navigating the weathered stone steps. Something about this discovery had awakened a determination she hadn't felt since James's death. If her family's property contained historical secrets, she deserved to know them before surrendering the land to foreclosure. The steps descended, about 8 feet below ground level, opening into a low-ceilinged space that extended beyond the reach of her flashlight beam. The air was surprisingly dry and much warmer than the November chill above. As her eyes adjusted, Eleanor could make out brick walls reinforced with timber supports and a packed earth floor worn smooth by long-ago footsteps. "Mrs. Wright," Hector called from above, concern evident in his voice. "What do you see?" "It's a room," Eleanor called back, her voice echoing slightly. "A hidden room." She advanced carefully, sweeping the flashlight across the space. The chamber was roughly 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, with the brick walls rising to meet a ceiling of massive oak beams. At the far end, she could make out what appeared to be a narrow tunnel extending northward. As Eleanor moved deeper into the chamber, her flashlight beam caught something unexpected: a small wooden shelf built into the eastern wall. On it sat several objects covered in thick dust. What appeared to be a tin cup, a crude oil lamp, and most surprisingly, a wooden box about the size of a thick novel. With trembling fingers, Eleanor lifted the box, wiping away decades of dust. The wood was smooth with age, but showed remarkable craftsmanship, with dovetailed corners and a small metal clasp. When she carefully opened it, she found it contained several folded documents, the paper yellowed but remarkably intact in the room's stable environment. "Mrs. Wright?" Hector called again, more insistently. "I'm coming down there. It might not be structurally sound." But Eleanor barely heard him. She had unfolded the topmost document, and what she saw caused her breath to catch. At the bottom of what appeared to be a letter was an unmistakable signature. A. Lincoln. "Oh, my God!" she whispered, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the precious document. She carefully refolded it, placed it back in the box with the others, and clutched the container to her chest as she heard Hector making his way down the stone steps. "You need to come back up, Mrs. Wright," he insisted upon reaching her. "We don't know if this space is safe after all these years." Eleanor nodded numbly, allowing herself to be guided back toward the steps. The wooden box still clutched against her body. Her mind was racing with implications. If these documents were authentic, and that signature had looked heartbreakingly genuine, the historical significance could be enormous. And perhaps, just perhaps, it might offer a path to saving her home. Once back in the relative safety of the barn's main floor, Eleanor carefully opened the box again, under Hector's curious gaze. Together, they examined its contents. 5 letters in total, each folded and remarkably preserved. The first, the one bearing Lincoln's signature, was dated April 1859, nearly 2 years before he would become president. "To my trusted friend, E. Wright," Eleanor read aloud, her voice quavering with emotion. "Your continued assistance in our most moral endeavor brings hope in these darkest hours. The souls you have guided northward now breathe the air of freedom, a testament to your courage and convictions." The letter continued, carefully avoiding specific details, but clearly referencing assistance with the Underground Railroad. It was signed, "With deepest gratitude and respect, A. Lincoln." "Mrs. Wright," breathed Hector, "if that's authentic, it's priceless." The other letters in the collection were equally remarkable. Correspondence from prominent abolitionists of the era, detailed maps of routes heading northward toward Ohio, and most significantly, a small leather-bound journal with the name Ezekiel Wright stamped on its cover. Eleanor sank onto a nearby hay bale, the full weight of her discovery beginning to register. Her husband's ancestor hadn't just been a successful farmer. He had been an active conductor on the Underground Railroad, using this very barn as a station to harbor escaped slaves on their journey to freedom. And he had apparently been corresponding with Abraham Lincoln himself, years before Lincoln would ascend to the presidency and issue the Emancipation Proclamation. "We need to stop the demolition," Eleanor said decisively. "Immediately." Hector nodded in agreement. "I'll tell the crew to secure the site, but Mrs. Wright, what are you going to do? The bank's foreclosure is still moving forward." Eleanor looked down at the documents in her hands, then back at the hidden chamber that had silently preserved her family's secret legacy for over 160 years. "I'm going to make some calls," she said, a new determination in her voice, starting with the Kentucky Historical Society. By nightfall, Eleanor's quiet farmhouse had become the center of unexpected activity. Dr. Marcus Tate, head curator of the Kentucky Historical Society, had arrived within hours of her call, bringing with him a team of preservation specialists and an archivist who specialized in Civil War-era documents. The initial assessment had left them all in a state of barely contained excitement. "These appear to be authentic," Dr. Tate confirmed, carefully examining the Lincoln letter under specialized lighting. The paper composition, ink characteristics, and penmanship all align with known Lincoln correspondence from this period. And this location would make perfect sense as a strategic underground railroad station, close enough to the Ohio River for relatively quick access to free states, but far enough inland to provide some security. Eleanor watched as the experts photographed and carefully preserved each document, her mind still struggling to reconcile this new reality with the family history she had always known. Why wouldn't this be part of our family stories? Something this significant, this honorable? Dr. Tate looked up from his work, his expression thoughtful. Post-Civil War Kentucky was complex, Mrs. Wright. While officially remaining in the Union, Kentucky was deeply divided in its sympathies. After the war, being known as an abolitionist could still bring social and economic consequences, even physical danger. Many Underground Railroad conductors took their activities to the grave, especially in border states. So Ezekiel Wright erased his own heroism from our family history, Eleanor mused, to protect his descendants. "And built a false floor over the evidence," added the structural historian who had been examining the hidden chamber. "The construction suggests it was deliberately concealed sometime around 1870, based on the woodworking techniques and materials." As the experts continued their work, Eleanor retreated to her kitchen, making coffee for the impromptu research team while trying to process the implications. The historical significance was undeniable, but her practical concerns remained. The bank wouldn't stop foreclosure proceedings for historical interest alone. Her phone rang, displaying her daughter's name. Eleanor had texted Amelia earlier with a brief, somewhat cryptic message about a significant discovery at the farm. "Mom, what's going on?" Amelia's voice came through clearly despite the international connection. "Your text sounded urgent but mysterious." Eleanor took a deep breath and began explaining the day's extraordinary events. As she spoke, she could hear her daughter's reactions shifting from confusion to amazement. Lincoln letters. An actual Underground Railroad station in our barn. Amelia's voice rose with each question. "Mom, that's incredible. Have you contacted the historical preservation authorities?" "They're here now," Eleanor confirmed, glancing out her kitchen window toward the barn, where lights now illuminated the previously dark structure. "But Amelia, it doesn't solve our immediate problem. Historical significance doesn't pay off the mortgage." There was a pause on the line before Amelia responded. "Actually, Mom, it might. Remember Captain Reeves in my unit? His sister works for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. This kind of discovery, Lincoln correspondence, intact Underground Railroad architecture, it could qualify for emergency preservation grants, maybe even National Historic Landmark status." For the first time since James's death, Eleanor felt a flickering of genuine hope. "You really think so?" "It's worth exploring urgently," Amelia insisted. "I'm going to make some calls on my end. And Mom, Don't sign anything with the bank until we've exhausted these options. After ending the call with her daughter, Eleanor returned to the barn, where Dr. Tate was emerging from the underground chamber, his expression alight with academic excitement. "Mrs. Wright, there's more," he announced. "Much more. The tunnel extends approximately 30 yards northward before opening into a larger chamber. We haven't fully explored it yet for safety reasons, but initial observations suggest it could accommodate perhaps 15 to 20 people. There are remnants of primitive sleeping pallets, cooking implements, even what appears to be a rudimentary ventilation system." Eleanor struggled to comprehend the scope of what lay beneath her property, an extensive, sophisticated underground railroad station that had operated in complete secrecy, then been deliberately preserved by her husband's ancestor before being concealed from history. "Your Ezekiel Wright wasn't just a casual supporter of the abolitionist movement," Dr. Tate continued. "Based on the scale of this operation and the correspondence with Lincoln, he was likely a major conductor in this region, potentially responsible for helping hundreds of escaped slaves reach freedom." The magnitude of this legacy settled over Eleanor like a mantle of responsibility. This wasn't just about saving her home anymore. It was about preserving a crucial piece of American history that had almost been lost forever, would have been lost, if financial desperation hadn't driven her to tear down the barn. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Dr. Tate's response was immediate and passionate. "With your permission, we'd like to bring in additional specialists, archaeologists, preservation architects, documentary historians. This site needs to be thoroughly documented and preserved. It's of national significance, Mrs. Wright." "And the documents?" "They'll need proper conservation and authentication by specialized labs, but I've seen enough to stake my professional reputation on their authenticity. The Lincoln letter alone is a major historical find, combined with the intact Underground Railroad station." He shook his head in wonder. "It's unprecedented in Kentucky." Eleanor nodded slowly, then voiced her practical concern. "Dr. Tate, I'm facing foreclosure in 6 weeks. The bank doesn't care about historical significance." The historian's expression became determined. "Mrs. Wright, I can't make promises, but discoveries of this magnitude can access emergency funding mechanisms that bypass normal bureaucratic timelines. May I make some calls on your behalf? There are private foundations, federal emergency preservation grants, even crowdfunding options, specifically for historical emergencies." "Please," Eleanor agreed, feeling as though she had stepped into someone else's life. Just hours ago, she had been a bankrupt widow, preparing to dismantle her last valuable asset. Now she stood as the custodian of a historical treasure of national importance. As Dr. Tate stepped away to make his calls, Hector approached Eleanor with something in his hands, Ezekiel Wright's journal, which the historians had finished photographing. "They said you might want to read this," he explained, handing her the small leather volume. "It's your family history, after all." Eleanor accepted the journal with reverent hands, finding a quiet corner of the barn to sit while the experts continued their work. The handwriting was cramped but legible, the entries spanning from 1858 to 1865. As she began to read, Ezekiel Wright's voice reached across more than a century and a half to speak directly to her. "April 17th, 1858. Purchased. The Kentucky property today. The agent believes I am simply a Virginia farmer seeking more fertile lands. If he knew my true purpose, I would likely be driven out before settling. The barn must be my first construction priority, designed with the hidden chamber as planned by the Philadelphia Society." Entry after entry documented the secret construction of the Underground Railroad station beneath what the community believed was simply an impressive new barn. Ezekiel detailed the challenges, the fear of discovery, the coded messages from other conductors, and most movingly, brief mentions of the people he helped to freedom, never named, but remembered by brief descriptors. Mother with infant, elderly, man with whipping scars, young brothers separated from parents. Most surprising to Eleanor were the numerous references to Lincoln, then still an Illinois lawyer and politician. According to Ezekiel's journal, they had first met in 1854 and formed a cautious alliance based on shared abolitionist convictions. The Lincoln documented in these private pages was more radical in his views than historical accounts generally portrayed him, using his legal connections to help support the Underground Railroad network while maintaining plausible deniability. February 12, 1861, correspondence today from L., now in Washington preparing for his inauguration. He assures me that despite the compromises he must publicly make, his heart remains with our cause. I believe him, though dark days surely lie ahead. Eleanor was so engrossed in the journal that she barely noticed Dr. Tate's return until he gently touched her shoulder. Looking up, she was surprised to see genuine excitement on the historian's face. "Mrs. Wright, I've made several calls. The National Trust for Historic Preservation is extraordinarily interested. They're sending representatives tomorrow morning. Additionally, the Smithsonian Institution has expressed immediate interest in the Lincoln letters, potentially for acquisition or loan. Either option would involve significant financial considerations." Eleanor blinked, trying to process this. "Information? You mean they might purchase the letters? That's one possibility. Another is a long-term loan arrangement with an endowment to maintain the physical site. But more immediately, I've spoken with a preservation attorney who specializes in emergency historical conservation. She believes we have grounds for an immediate injunction against the foreclosure based on the national historical significance of the discovery." For the first time in 18 months, Eleanor felt something like her old self, the capable woman she had been before grief and financial disaster had hollowed her out. "What do I need to do?" "For tonight, allow my team to secure the site and continue preliminary documentation. Tomorrow will bring a whirlwind of officials, I expect. The attorney will meet us here at 8 to prepare the emergency injunction filing." Eleanor nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she felt after the day's emotional roller coaster. She glanced down at Ezekiel Wright's journal, then back at the exposed entrance to the hidden chamber that had silently preserved her family's true legacy. "I'll be here," she promised, "not just to Dr. Tate, but to the memory of Ezekiel Wright and the countless unnamed souls who had passed through this secret sanctuary on their journey to freedom." As Eleanor prepared to leave the barn, Hector approached with a gentle smile. "Quite a day, Mrs. Wright. Looks like this old barn might save your farm after all, just not in the way we expected." Eleanor returned his smile, her first genuine one in months. "My husband's ancestor built this place to protect people seeking freedom. Maybe, in its own way, it's still doing exactly that." That night, alone in the farmhouse that had almost slipped from her grasp, Eleanor continued reading Ezekiel's journal by lamplight. One entry in particular, dated July 1863, shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg, seemed to reach across time with particular poignancy. "In these darkest hours, I question whether our nation can survive its own contradictions. Yet each time I guide another soul toward freedom, I am reminded that the moral arc of history, though long, bends toward justice. What we preserve in secret today may be honored openly by future generations, who will look back and wonder why. Such extraordinary measures were necessary for such a self-evident truth, that all people deserve liberty. I may not live to see that day, but I build this sanctuary with faith that my descendants will inhabit a more just world, where the courage of good men and women is remembered." Eleanor closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, legal battles, preservation concerns, media attention once the story broke. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel connected to something larger than her individual struggles. Ezekiel Wright had preserved his legacy in silence, hiding his heroism beneath ordinary floorboards. Now, over a century and a half later, his great-great-great-granddaughter-in-law would ensure that legacy finally received the recognition it deserved. As she drifted toward sleep, Eleanor realized that the farm she had been fighting to save was more than just property. It was hallowed, ground that had witnessed a crucial chapter in America's journey toward fulfilling its founding promise of freedom. Whatever happened with the bank, that legacy could never be foreclosed upon. Eleanor awoke before dawn, her mind already racing with the implications of yesterday's extraordinary discovery. Sleep had come in fitful bursts, interrupted by dreams, where Abraham Lincoln himself walked through the underground chamber beneath her barn, speaking in Ezekiel Wright's voice. As the first grey light filtered through her bedroom curtains, she found herself drawn back to the barn, a need to reassure herself that yesterday hadn't been an elaborate fantasy born of financial desperation. The security team hired by the Kentucky Historical Society nodded respectfully as she approached. The barn was illuminated from within, specialists having worked through the night to document the site before the arrival of additional experts. Eleanor entered quietly, not wanting to disturb their methodical work. Dr. Tate looked up from his laptop where he was cataloguing photographs. Despite having clearly worked through the night, his eyes were bright with scholarly excitement. "Mrs. Wright, perfect timing. We've made additional discoveries you should see." He led her to a table where several items were carefully arranged on acid-free paper. These were found concealed in a small cavity behind one of the brick walls, apparently a purpose-built hiding spot. He indicated a tarnished metal box, approximately the size of a large dictionary. Inside the box lay several objects that took Eleanor's breath away. A small pistol of Civil War-era design, a leather pouch containing gold coins dated between 1840 and 1858, a carefully folded quilt with an unusual geometric pattern, and most intriguingly, a small leather-bound book with no identifying marks on its cover. "The conservator has only had a preliminary look at the book," Dr. Tate explained, "but it appears to be a registry of some kind, coded entries that likely documented the individuals who passed through this station." Eleanor stared at the objects, each representing a tangible connection to the hidden history beneath her property. The quilt in particular caught her attention. "Is this what I think it is?" Dr. Tate nodded. "We believe so. The pattern matches known examples of quilts used in the Underground Railroad's visual communication system. Different geometric designs conveyed specific messages to those who knew how to read them." Before Eleanor could respond, a young archaeologist approached with evident excitement. "Dr. Tate, we've completed the initial survey of the northern chamber. You're going to want to see this immediately." With curious anticipation, Eleanor followed them through the now properly supported tunnel that extended from the main underground room. The passage was remarkably well constructed, its brick walls still solid after more than a century and a half. The air grew slightly cooler as they progressed, illuminated by the battery-powered work lights the team had installed overnight. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber that left Eleanor momentarily speechless. Unlike the first room, which had been relatively austere, this space contained remnants of what had clearly been living quarters for multiple people. The remains of wooden sleeping platforms along the walls, a stone hearth built into one corner, with a cleverly disguised chimney system, shelving that still held preserved items, cookware, candle holders, and most remarkably, several books. "This wasn't just a way station," the archaeologist explained. her voice hushed with reverence. This was a longer-term refuge, perhaps for those too ill or vulnerable to continue immediately northward, or during periods when the next stations were under surveillance. But what truly captured Eleanor's attention was the far wall of the chamber. There, partially preserved despite the passage of time, were dozens of handprints pressed into what had once been wet plaster. Handprints of varying sizes, from large adult hands to tiny childlike impressions. "They left their mark," Eleanor whispered, approaching the wall with tears welling in her eyes, "to show they were here, that they existed." Dr. Tate nodded solemnly. "It's unprecedented documentation. Each handprint potentially represents a life saved, a person who reached freedom because of your ancestors' courage." As Eleanor stood before this powerful testament, a conservation specialist carefully examined the books found on the shelves. "Dr. Tate," she called, "you need to see this immediately." The book she held was a Bible, its leather binding cracked with age, but still intact. "Look at the inscription," she urged, carefully opening to the frontispiece. There, in faded ink, was written, "Presented to Ezekiel Wright, with profound gratitude for his unwavering moral courage. May this good book continue to guide your righteous path. A. Lincoln, December 25th, 1862. "A Christmas gift," breathed Dr. Tate, "given during the darkest days of the Civil War, just days before Lincoln would issue the Emancipation Proclamation." Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the historical weight surrounding her. "He knew my husband's ancestor personally, well enough to give him a Bible as a Christmas present." "This suggests a relationship far deeper than we initially understood," Dr. Tate agreed. "Not just correspondence, but genuine friendship and alliance." Their contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Hector, who had returned to the farm earlier than expected. "Mrs. Wright, there's a whole convoy coming up your driveway. Looks like government vehicles, news vans, the works. Word has gotten out." Eleanor took a deep breath, steeling herself. The peaceful exploration of her family's unexpected legacy was about to become considerably more complicated. "I suppose it was inevitable," she sighed. "Dr. Tate, what should I expect?" The historian's expression was sympathetic but resolute. "A storm of attention, I'm afraid. Historical discoveries of this magnitude, particularly with direct Lincoln connections, don't stay quiet. But remember, this attention brings protection as well. The more public this becomes, the harder it will be for the bank to proceed with foreclosure as though this were just another distressed property." Eleanor nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Then let's face them together." Outside, the crisp November morning had brought a procession of vehicles up the farm's long gravel driveway. Eleanor recognized the logos of several national news networks, vehicles from various historical organizations, and most concerningly, a sleek black car bearing the emblem of Midland Financial Group, her mortgage holder. A distinguished woman in her early 60s approached Eleanor first, extending her hand. "Mrs. Wright? I'm Barbara Hollingsworth, National Trust for Historic Preservation. We spoke with Dr. Tate last night. This is truly remarkable." Before Eleanor could respond properly, they were joined by a severe-looking man in an expensive suit. "Mrs. Wright, Thomas Blackwell, Senior Vice President, Midland Financial. We need to discuss this. Development. Immediately." Dr. Tate stepped protectively to Eleanor's side. "Mr. Blackwell, I presume you're aware that we're filing for an emergency injunction this morning to halt any foreclosure proceedings in light of the historical significance of this property." The banker's expression tightened. "Dr. Tate, while I appreciate the historical enthusiasm, Midland Financial has a fiduciary responsibility to its shareholders. Mrs. Wright remains substantially in default on her mortgage obligations." "Perhaps we could discuss this privately," Eleanor suggested, eyeing the news crews now setting up cameras at the edge of the property. "I believe that would be wise," agreed Ms. Hollingsworth from the National Trust. "And I think Mr. Blackwell might want to hear some of our preliminary proposals before making any statements to the press about Midland's position." The banker hesitated, then nodded curtly. "My legal team will be joining us shortly." As they moved toward the farmhouse, Eleanor's phone rang, Amelia calling from Germany. "Mom, it's all over the news here. Civil War Underground Railroad discovery with Lincoln connection. Are you okay?" "Managing so far," Eleanor replied, the surreal quality of the situation hitting her anew. "Things are happening very quickly." "I've been approved for emergency leave," Amelia said. "I'll be on a flight tonight. Don't make any decisions until I get there, okay?" The support in her daughter's voice gave Eleanor an additional measure of strength. "I'll hold the fort until you arrive. I love you. Love you too, Mom. And Mom, I'm so proud of what great-great-great-grandfather Ezekiel did, and I'm proud of you for finding it." Those words carried Eleanor through the tense meeting that followed in her farmhouse kitchen. Thomas Blackwell and his hastily assembled legal team presented a facade of sympathetic understanding while making it clear that historical significance didn't erase financial obligations. "We're prepared to offer a 30-day extension on the foreclosure timeline," the bank's attorney proposed, "to allow for proper documentation of the historical findings before the property changes hands." "That's entirely insufficient," countered Patricia Winters, the preservation attorney who had arrived to represent Eleanor's interests. "This site qualifies for expedited consideration as a National Historic Landmark. The Lincoln connection alone ensures that." Barbara Hollingsworth from the National Trust leaned forward. "Midland Financial has an opportunity here, Mr. Blackwell. Your institution could be remembered as the villain who attempted to bulldoze a priceless piece of American history, or as the visionary partner who helped preserve it. Which narrative would your shareholders prefer?" The banker shifted uncomfortably. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A partnership," Hollingsworth replied without hesitation. "The National Trust is prepared to enter into immediate negotiations to either purchase the property outright, with Mrs. Wright retaining lifetime residential rights, or to establish a conservation easement with substantial financial considerations. To both Mrs. Wright and Midland Financial." Eleanor watched the calculations happening behind Blackwell's eyes. "And if we decline?" Patricia Winters smiled thinly. "Then we proceed with the emergency injunction, followed by petitions for federal intervention under the Historical Sites Act. The resulting legal proceedings would likely extend for years, during which time the property remains in limbo. No foreclosure, no resolution, and increasingly negative publicity for Midland Financial. We would need assurances of the property's historical authenticity," Blackwell said after a tense silence. "Our own experts would need to verify." He was interrupted by a commotion outside, the arrival of yet more vehicles. Through her kitchen window, Eleanor recognized the official cars of the Kentucky governor and what appeared to be federal government vehicles. Dr. Tate checked his phone and let out a small whistle. The Smithsonian Institution and National Archives have both dispatched senior representatives. Governor Williams is apparently making a personal visit. "Mr. Blackwell, I believe the authentication you're concerned about is already well underway." The banker's expression shifted subtly as he reassessed his position. "Perhaps a short recess to consult with my team would be appropriate." As the bank representative stepped outside to confer, Eleanor found herself momentarily alone with Dr. Tate and Ms. Hollingsworth. "They're realizing they can't win this fight," Hollingsworth said quietly. "Not against the combined weight of state historical societies, the National Trust, the Smithsonian, and the governor's office. The question now is how they extract themselves while saving face. What does this mean for me Eleanor asked, the practical concerns of her precarious financial situation still pressing despite the historical whirlwind. Best case scenario? Hollingsworth considered. The National Trust purchases the property at fair market value, plus a premium for the historical significance. Your mortgage is satisfied in full. You retain lifetime residential rights to the farmhouse and a designated portion of the land. The Underground Railroad site becomes a professionally managed historic attraction with appropriate conservation, measures and educational programming. And I go from bankrupt widow to what? Site manager of my own historic home? Eleanor asked, uncertain how to feel about this prospect. Dr. Tate smiled gently. Mrs. Wright, if you're amenable, I suspect you'll be offered a position as the site's first director. Your connection to the property's history, combined with your evident appreciation for its significance, would make you ideal. It would come with a salary commensurate with such positions, of course. Before Eleanor could process this unexpected turn of events, the door opened and Thomas Blackwell returned. His demeanor noticeably shifted. Mrs. Wright, in light of the extraordinary circumstances, Midland Financial would like to propose an immediate suspension of all foreclosure activities while we work with the National Trust to explore their acquisition proposal. And my outstanding debt, Eleanor pressed, unwilling to leave her financial future in ambiguity, would be fully satisfied by the sale proceeds, assuming the National Trust's valuation is accepted. Blackwell confirmed, his tone suggesting he now saw more advantage in cooperation than conflict. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Governor Williams arrived with a full entourage, making a brief statement to the assembled press about Kentucky's commitment to preserving this newly discovered chapter in our state's complex Civil War history. Representatives from the Smithsonian meticulously examined the Lincoln Letters and Bible, confirming their likely authenticity and historical significance. The National Archives dispatched specialists to begin the delicate process of documenting and preserving Ezekiel Wright's journals. By late afternoon, Eleanor found herself standing once again at the entrance to the underground chamber, momentarily alone, as the various experts, officials, and media representatives conferred in different parts of the property. The enormity of the past 24 hours washed over her, from the brink of losing everything to becoming the custodian of a national historical treasure. A gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. Quite a change of fortune. Eleanor turned to find an elderly African-American woman watching her with keen interest. She appeared to be in her 80s, elegant in a blue pantsuit, her white hair cropped close to her head. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. "With everything happening today, I don't believe we've been introduced." "Josephine Baker," the woman said, extending a hand. "I'm a historian specializing in Underground Railroad documentation, but I'm here for more personal reasons as well." She gestured toward the underground chamber. "My great-great-grandfather passed through a station very much like this one on his journey to freedom in 1860. His name was Isaiah Freeman." Eleanor felt a profound connection to this woman, whose ancestor might have been among those sheltered by her husband's forebear. "It's an honor to meet you, Dr. Baker." "The honor is mine," Josephine replied warmly. "When I heard about this discovery, particularly the registry book and the wall of handprints, I had to come immediately. You see, family oral history suggests that Isaiah passed through a Kentucky station operated by a man called the Shepherd. Some historians have suspected that might have been a code name for Ezekiel Wright, but we've never had confirmation." Eleanor thought of the registry book currently being examined by conservators. "Do you think your ancestor might be recorded there?" "It's my dearest hope," Josephine admitted. "Isaiah kept a small journal of his journey north, which has been preserved in our family. He described a kind farmer who had a special hiding place beneath his barn, where Isaiah recovered from illness for nearly 3 weeks before continuing onward. He mentioned that this farmer had him press his hand into wet plaster alongside others who had passed through, a ritual of remembrance. Eleanor felt a chill run through her. The wall of handprints. Exactly. Josephine nodded, her eyes bright with emotion. Isaiah wrote that the shepherd told him, "One day, when all are free, these marks will testify that you were here, that you persevered, that you claimed your God-given liberty." The two women stood in silence for a moment, separated by race and generation, but connected by the intertwined histories of their ancestors, one who sought freedom and one who helped provide it. "Mrs. Wright," Josephine finally said, "what you've discovered here isn't just a physical structure or historical artifacts. It's evidence of moral courage in a time when such courage carried enormous risk. Your ancestor chose the righteous path when many around him chose comfort and complicity." Eleanor thought about the Ezekiel Wright revealed in his journals, not the sanitized family narrative of a successful farmer, but the complex reality of a man who risked everything for his deepest moral convictions. "I never knew him," Eleanor said softly. "The family stories never mentioned any of this, but reading his words, seeing what he built here, I feel like I'm finally meeting the real Ezekiel Wright." "History is full of hidden heroes," Josephine observed, "people who did what was right without expectation of recognition or reward. Sometimes their stories remain buried for generations until the right moment arrives for them to be told." As evening approached, the activity at the farm began to settle into more organized patterns. The governor and most media had departed, while teams of specialists continued their careful documentation work. Security had been enhanced, with state police now patrolling the perimeter of the property to protect the historically significant site. Eleanor found herself sitting on her farmhouse porch with Barbara Hollingsworth from the National Trust, watching the sunset paint the November sky in shades of orange and pink. "The preliminary paperwork has been filed," Hollingsworth informed her. "The bank has formally suspended foreclosure proceedings pending our acquisition proposal. Your immediate financial concerns should be alleviated." "It doesn't seem real," Eleanor admitted. "Yesterday I was preparing to lose everything. Instead, you've preserved something priceless," Hollingsworth replied. "Not just for yourself, but for the nation's understanding of its own history." "What happens next?" Eleanor asked, trying to envision her future in this new reality. "A great deal of careful planning and preservation work," Hollingsworth explained. "The site will need to be properly stabilized and prepared for eventual public access. The artifacts will require conservation and secure display facilities. Educational materials will need to be developed, but the fundamentals are extraordinarily promising. An intact underground railroad station with direct Lincoln connections and documented evidence of those who passed through. It's the most complete site of its kind ever discovered." Eleanor nodded, thinking about Josephine Baker and her search for her ancestors' handprint on that underground wall. "It needs to honor them, the people who passed through seeking freedom. That has to be the primary focus." "I couldn't agree more," Hollingsworth said approvingly. "And that's precisely why we'd like you to consider taking an active role in shaping how this site develops. Your perspective as both a connection to Ezekiel Wright and someone who understands the importance of centering those who sought freedom would be invaluable." As darkness fell over the farm that had been in her husband's family for generations, Eleanor felt a profound sense of purpose, replacing the desperation that had consumed her for so long. The financial burden that had nearly crushed her was lifting, but more importantly, she had become the unlikely custodian of a legacy far more significant than she could have imagined. In Ezekiel Wright's hidden chamber, illuminated now by professional lighting and carefully monitored by conservation specialists, The handprints of those who had passed through on their journey to freedom remained pressed into the plaster walls, silent witnesses to courage, perseverance, and hope. Eleanor had discovered not just a historical site, but a sacred space where the highest American ideals had been quietly, dangerously, heroically lived. As she prepared for bed that night, Eleanor found herself looking forward to Amelia's arrival. The following day, together, they would navigate this unexpected new chapter, not as the last caretakers of a failing family farm, but as the first stewards of a newly discovered national treasure. The barn that she had been prepared to dismantle board by board had instead revealed its heart, beating with a history both painful and inspiring. A history that would now be preserved for generations to come. Eleanor woke before dawn on the third day of her extraordinary journey, pulled from sleep by the distant sound of car tires on the gravel driveway. Wrapping herself in her robe, she peered through the curtains to see a military transport vehicle arriving. Amelia was home. Mother and daughter collided in a fierce embrace on the farmhouse porch, holding each other tightly in the pale pre-dawn light. When they finally separated, Eleanor was struck by the determination in her daughter's eyes, the same expression Amelia had worn when deploying to combat zones. "I came prepared for battle," Amelia said, dropping her duffel bag on the porch. "But it looks like you've already won the war." Eleanor smiled, feeling a surge of pride in her daughter's immediate readiness to fight for their home. "Not won, exactly, but we've negotiated better terms than surrender." As they entered the farmhouse, Eleanor prepared coffee while bringing Amelia up to speed on the whirlwind developments. Despite having followed news reports from overseas, Amelia was staggered by the physical reality of what lay beneath the barn her family had taken for granted for generations. "I want to see it," she insisted, cradling her coffee mug. "All of it." They walked together through the dawn light toward the barn, where security personnel now maintained a 24-hour presence. Inside, the early rising researchers greeted them warmly, several expressing particular excitement at meeting another Wright descendant. "Captain Wright," Dr. Tate said, shaking Amelia's hand, "your mother has been remarkable throughout this extraordinary process. Military leadership clearly runs in the family." Amelia smiled, but her attention was already drawn to the exposed entrance to the underground chambers. "May we?" she asked, gesturing toward the stone steps descending into history. With reverent steps, mother and daughter descended together, into the space that had altered their family's narrative forever. Eleanor watched as Amelia absorbed the physical reality of Ezekiel Wright's secret operation, the carefully constructed brick walls, the hidden tunnel, the second chamber with its wall of handprints. "I used to play in this barn as a kid," Amelia whispered, running her fingers along the aged brick. "All those summers, all those rainy afternoons building hay forts. And this was beneath our feet the entire time." Eleanor nodded, understanding perfectly the sense of hidden histories suddenly revealed. "Your father used to repair equipment right above this spot. 4 generations of Wrights lived and worked here without knowing what Ezekiel had created." Detersen. They stood in silence before the wall of handprints, each lost in contemplation of the souls who had passed through this sanctuary, people whose names might never be known, but whose courage was literally imprinted into the very structure. "When I was deployed," Amelia said quietly, "I used to wonder if anything I did really mattered in the grand scheme of history, if my service would leave any lasting mark." She reached out, hovering her own hand over one of the smaller prints, possibly left by a child. Ezekiel never sought recognition. He just did what was right, then concealed it to protect those who came after him. Eleanor thought about how differently she viewed her family legacy now, not just as inherited property, but as a sacred trust. That's the part I keep coming back to. He didn't do this for acclaim. He did it because his conscience demanded it. As they explored further, Dr. Josephine Baker arrived to continue her research. Her face lit up upon meeting Amelia. Another generation of Wrights. How wonderful to see the family line continuing to care for this precious site. Dr. Baker believes her ancestor may have passed through this very station, Eleanor explained. Isaiah Freeman, Josephine elaborated, and I have exciting news. The conservation team has made progress with the registry book found in the hidden wall cavity. They've begun deciphering the coded entries, and there appears to be an entry from March 1860 that matches details from my family's oral history. The three women huddled around Josephine's tablet, where she displayed images of the carefully preserved registry pages. The entries were written in a sophisticated cipher, with symbols representing individuals rather than recording actual names. A necessary precaution should the book ever be discovered by slave hunters or sympathetic authorities. See this symbol, here. Josephine indicated a distinctive mark, resembling an artistic letter I, with a small star above it. It appears alongside notes about a man recovering from fever for 19 days. My great-great-grandfather's journal mentions being ill with fever for nearly 3 weeks at the shepherd's station. The dates align perfectly. Eleanor felt goosebumps rise on her arms at this tangible connection between Josephine's family and her own. So our ancestors knew each other, helped each other. More than knew each other, Josephine corrected gently. They trusted each other with their lives in a time when such trust carried the highest stakes imaginable. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Barbara Hollingsworth and a distinguished-looking gentleman in his 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. "Mrs. Wright, Captain Wright," Hollingsworth called. "May I introduce Charles Pemberton, Director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He's flown in specifically to see the site." The next hour was spent guiding Director Pemberton through the underground chambers, watching his expert eye assess the historical significance of each element. His profound knowledge of Underground Railroad history brought new insights to features they had already documented. The ventilation system is particularly sophisticated, he noted, examining the cleverly disguised air shafts. Most stations we've studied had much more primitive arrangements, and this heating setup, drawing warmth from the livestock above, without creating detectable smoke patterns, shows remarkable engineering insight. When they reached the wall of handprints, Pemberton fell silent, visibly moved. "In all my years of historical preservation," he finally said, "I've never encountered such a direct physical connection to those who traveled the railroad. We have documents, artifacts, even some structures, but these handprints..." He reached out, stopping just short of touching the wall. "These are their testimony, their witness." "That's exactly how I feel," Eleanor said. "These aren't just historical artifacts. They're sacred." Pemberton turned to face Eleanor and Amelia. "The Smithsonian would like to formally propose a partnership with the National Trust in preserving this site. We envision creating a living historical museum that honors both those who sought freedom and those who risked everything to provide it." "What would that entail?" Amelia asked, her military training evident in her direct approach. "A comprehensive preservation of the underground chambers, professional restoration of the barn above to its 1859 condition, and conversion of a portion of the property into an educational center," Pemberton explained. "The farmhouse would remain private, with your family retaining residential rights in perpetuity." "And the financial aspects?" Eleanor inquired, still mindful of the practical realities despite the historical excitement. Hollingsworth stepped forward. "We've prepared a preliminary proposal. The National Trust would purchase the property at 150% of pre-discovery market value, clearing all existing debt and providing substantial additional compensation. A trust would be established to maintain the site in perpetuity, with both of you named as founding trustees, with lifetime appointments if you wish. Eleanor and Amelia exchanged glances, a lifetime of unspoken understanding passing between them. "We'd need time to review any formal documents," Amelia said, "but speaking personally, knowing this place would be preserved properly means more than any financial consideration." By midday, the farm had transformed into what resembled a cross between an archaeological expedition and a high-level governmental conference. Representatives from the Department of the Interior arrived to begin the formal process of evaluating the site for National Historic Landmark status. Preservation architects measured and documented every inch of the underground chambers. Historians huddled over the documents and artifacts, each new translation from Ezekiel's journals, adding dimension to the emerging picture of his clandestine operation. Eleanor found herself drawn to a conversation between Dr. Baker and a linguistics specialist who was working on the coded registry. They had spread their materials across a makeshift workstation near the barn entrance, their excitement palpable. "Mrs. Wright," Dr. Baker called, waving her over. "We've confirmed it definitively. Isaiah Freeman was here in this very station from March 3rd to March 22nd, 1860, and there's more. Ezekiel's journal entry for March 22nd. It mentions entrusting a man of exceptional intelligence and courage with a letter to deliver to our mutual friend in Springfield once he reached Chicago." "Lincoln," Eleanor breathed, the connections crystallizing further. "Exactly," the linguist confirmed. "We believe Isaiah Freeman may have served as a messenger between Ezekiel Wright and Abraham Lincoln, carrying information about the Underground Railroad network that was too sensitive to trust to postal services." This revelation struck Eleanor with particular force. The intertwining of these families across the generations, connected by courage and conviction in America's darkest hours, now reunited through historical discovery more than a century and a half later. As the afternoon progressed, Eleanor found herself pulled into a meeting with Thomas Blackwell from Midland Financial, who had returned with a more conciliatory approach than his initial visit. "Mrs. Wright," he began, uncharacteristically deferential, "Midland Financial has considered the extraordinary circumstances of this discovery and wishes to propose an adjustment to our position." Eleanor maintained a composed expression, though inwardly she marveled at how dramatically her leverage had shifted in just 3 days. "I'm listening, Mr. Blackwell, huh? In recognition of the national historical significance of the Wright property, Midland is prepared to forgive the entirety of your outstanding mortgage balance as a gesture of corporate citizenship and historical preservation," he stated, sliding a document across the table. "In exchange, we would request acknowledgement as a founding corporate sponsor of the preservation effort." Eleanor carefully maintained her neutral expression while scanning the document. "That's quite a change from foreclosure." Blackwell had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Midland's board recognizes an opportunity to be on the right side of history, and frankly, the potential negative publicity of being seen as the bank that foreclosed on an underground railroad station with Lincoln connections." He left the sentence unfinished. "I'll have our attorneys review this," Eleanor replied, neither accepting nor rejecting the offer. Her years as a farmer's wife had taught her the value of never appearing too eager during negotiations. After Blackwell departed, Eleanor sought out Amelia, finding her in conversation with a group of African-American history scholars near the wall of handprints. As Eleanor approached, she realized her daughter was not just listening, but actively contributing to the historical analysis. Captain Wright was just sharing some fascinating insights about the tactical defensive elements of the station's design, explained one of the scholars. Her military background offers a valuable perspective we hadn't fully considered. Amelia turned to her mother with excitement. "Mom, the layout of this place isn't just clever, it's tactically brilliant. The hidden observation ports, the multiple escape routes, the way the ventilation system could be rapidly sealed." Ezekiel Wright wasn't just a moral man, he was a strategic genius. Pride swelled in Eleanor's heart, seeing her daughter so passionately engaged with their newly discovered heritage. "Your great-great-great-grandfather would be proud to see you analyzing his work." As evening approached, the farm quieted somewhat, as many of the officials and researchers departed for nearby hotels, leaving only essential security personnel and a few dedicated conservationists working through the night. Eleanor and Amelia sat on the farmhouse porch, sharing a bottle of wine as they processed the extraordinary developments. "Midland offered to forgive the entire mortgage," Eleanor revealed, watching her daughter's expression shift from surprise to suspicion. "Complete forgiveness? What's the catch?" "Public recognition as a founding sponsor of the preservation effort. They want to be seen as the bank that helped save a national treasure, rather than the one that nearly demolished it." Amelia snorted. "Quite the image rehabilitation. Are you considering it?" Eleanor sipped her wine thoughtfully. "It would immediately resolve our financial crisis, but I'm waiting for the National Trust's formal offer before making any decisions. Barbara Hollingsworth mentioned their preliminary valuation exceeds the property's market value by a significant margin." "We're in a position to choose," Amelia marveled. 3 days ago, there were no options at all. The night sky above, the farm sparkled with stars, the same stars that had guided freedom seekers northward along the Underground Railroad. Eleanor found herself contemplating the courage it must have taken, both for those fleeing bondage and for those who risked everything to help them. "I keep thinking about Ezekiel's choices," she said softly. "He came to Kentucky from Virginia in 1858, just 3 years before the Civil War began. He must have known conflict was coming. Yet he still invested everything in creating this farm as a cover for his true mission." "He played the long game," Amelia observed, "building a legacy that would outlast him, even if no one knew the truth for generations." "And now we're the custodians of that truth," Eleanor said, the weight of responsibility settling comfortably on her shoulders. "Whatever financial arrangements we make, our first obligation is to honor what happened here, both the suffering and the courage." The following morning brought yet another unexpected development. Eleanor was reviewing preliminary preservation proposals with the National Trust team when Dr. Tate burst into the farmhouse, his academic composure momentarily abandoned in excitement. "Mrs. Wright, we've found something else, something we completely overlooked in the initial survey." Eleanor and the Trust representatives followed him urgently to the barn, where a team of structural engineers had been assessing the foundation for long-term preservation needs. "We were examining the ground beneath the first chamber when we detected an anomaly," the lead engineer explained. "Ground-penetrating radar showed what appeared to be another void approximately 4 feet beneath the floor of the main chamber." "And another hidden level?" Eleanor asked, astonished at the possibility of further concealed spaces. "Not exactly," Dr. Tate clarified. "More like a purposefully created vault. The conservation team has located what appears to be a concealed access point." They descended into the now familiar underground chamber, where conservationists had carefully removed a section of the brick flooring in the northeast corner, revealing a small iron door set into the foundation stones. "We haven't opened it yet," Dr. Tate explained, "given the historical significance of everything we've found. So far, we wanted you present for this." Eleanor felt a surge of emotion at this consideration, this acknowledgement of her family's connection to whatever secrets might still remain hidden. "Thank you for waiting. Amelia should be here too. She's just on a call with her commanding officer." As if summoned by her mother's words, Amelia appeared at the chamber entrance. "What's happening?" Security said something about another discovery. Once Amelia joined them, the conservation specialists proceeded with the carefully planned opening of the iron door. The ancient lock mechanism yielded reluctantly to their specialized tools, and with painstaking care, they swung the small door open to reveal a cavity approximately 2 feet square. Inside lay a single item, a small iron-bound chest, its wood darkened with age but remarkably well preserved in the dry, protected environment. With gloved hands, the lead conservationist lifted it carefully from its resting place and placed it on a prepared work surface. "The lock mechanism appears intact," she observed. "Late 1850s craftsmanship, consistent with the station's construction period." "Can it be opened safely?" Eleanor asked, her heart racing with anticipation. "Yes, though we'll need to proceed with extreme caution." Everyone in the chamber held their breath as the conservationist delicately manipulated the antique lock. With a soft click, it yielded, allowing the chest's lid to be raised for the first time in over 160 years. Inside, nestled on a bed of what appeared to be velvet cloth, now faded to a dull brown, lay several items: a small leather pouch, a folded document with an unbroken wax seal, and most remarkably, a wooden box containing what appeared to be jewelry. A gold locket and matching ring. Dr. Tate leaned forward, his expression reverent. "This appears to be a personal cache, rather than part of the Underground Railroad operation. Perhaps Ezekiel's most treasured possessions, hidden for safekeeping." The conservationist carefully unfolded the document, revealing a letter written in an elegant, feminine hand. "My dearest Ezekiel," she read aloud, "if you are reading this, then I have failed to reach you as planned. The patrols have increased since John Brown's raid, and my departure may be delayed." Eleanor felt a chill run through her as the conservationist continued reading the letter dated January 18th, 1860, signed, "With eternal devotion, your Rebecca." "Rebecca?" Eleanor questioned, looking to Dr. Tate. "Ezekiel's wife was named Sarah, according to our family records." Dr. Tate's expression reflected her confusion. "Yes, all historical documents indicate he married Sarah Miller in 1856 in Virginia, before relocating to Kentucky." The conservationist had moved on to examining the locket. With delicate tools, she opened it to reveal 2 miniature portraits. One of a stern-looking Ezekiel Wright, much younger than in the only family photograph Eleanor had seen, and the other of a beautiful African-American woman with intelligent eyes and a determined expression. "Oh my God," breathed Dr. Baker, who had joined them unnoticed. "I believe this may be Rebecca Freeman, Isaiah Freeman's sister." The implications of this discovery rippled through the chamber like an electric current. Josephine Baker's eyes filled with tears as she gazed at the portrait of the woman who might be her ancestor. Family oral history mentions that Isaiah had a sister named Rebecca who was separated from him during sale, she explained, her voice trembling with emotion. "She was believed to have attempted escape around 1860, but we never knew what became of her. The letter suggests she was planning to flee north with Ezekiel's help." Dr. Tate observed his historian's mind rapidly connecting the pieces. Perhaps they had formed a connection during a previous escape attempt. Or perhaps, Amelia suggested quietly, they had formed a deeper bond than history has recorded. The conservationist had moved on to the leather pouch, carefully loosening its drawstring. Inside were several gold coins and a folded document that proved to be a deed for property in Canada in the names of Ezekiel and Rebecca Wright. The chamber fell silent as the full implications became clear. Ezekiel Wright, the Virginia farmer who had established a Kentucky homestead as cover for his Underground Railroad activities, had apparently planned to escape north himself, with a woman he loved but could not legally marry in America's antebellum South. He wasn't just a conductor, Eleanor whispered, awestruck by this new dimension of her ancestors' story. He was planning his own freedom too, freedom to love without boundaries. But something happened to Rebecca, Josephine surmised, her historian's mind following the narrative thread. She never made it to Kentucky, and Ezekiel remained, continuing his dangerous work even after his personal hopes were dashed. Eleanor looked at the portrait of the woman who might have become her great-great-great-grandmother in another version of history, a woman whose courage and love had been hidden away beneath brick and earth for over a century and a half. "He stayed to help others find what he had lost," she said softly, "the chance for freedom and love without fear." As word of this latest discovery spread through the research teams, Eleanor found herself standing somewhat apart, watching as historians, archaeologists, and preservationists excitedly discussed the implications for their understanding of not just the Underground Railroad, but the complex human stories that drove its operation. Amelia joined her, slipping an arm around her mother's shoulders. "You okay?" Eleanor nodded slowly, just thinking about how stories get buried, literally and figuratively, how families create narratives that hide as much as they reveal. "Some truths were too dangerous to preserve openly," Amelia observed. Ezekiel's relationship with Rebecca would have put them both in mortal danger. And even after the war, in the Kentucky of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, their story would have remained dangerous to acknowledge, Eleanor added. So our family created a different narrative, the respectable farmer who married Sarah Miller. But he made sure the truth wouldn't be lost forever, Amelia pointed out. He preserved it here in the very foundation of the life he built. Eleanor watched as Dr. Baker cradled the locket containing her possible ancestor's portrait, her face alight with the wonder of unexpected connection. In that moment, Eleanor understood that what they had uncovered wasn't just historically significant, it was a testament to love that defied boundaries, courage that outlasted oppression, and truth that survived decades of enforced silence. The bank's foreclosure, which had seemed so devastating just days ago, had been the catalyst for unearthing not just a physical structure, but the hidden heart of her family's true legacy, a legacy of moral courage, compassionate action, and love that transcended the brutal limitations of its time. "Whatever happens next," Eleanor said, watching as experts carefully documented each item from the hidden chest, "this truth doesn't get buried again. Ezekiel and Rebecca's story deserves to be told." Amelia squeezed her mother's shoulders in silent agreement. Together, they watched as the past and present converged in the underground chamber, a sacred space where those who had been separated by history's cruelties were finally being reunited through the power of discovery, remembrance, and long-delayed justice. 1 year after the discovery beneath the old barn, Eleanor Wright stood on a custom-built observation platform overlooking what had become known nationally as the Wright-Freeman Underground Railroad Center. The summer sun warmed her shoulders as she watched groups of visitors being guided through the carefully preserved site by trained docents, many of them descendants of those who had traveled the Underground Railroad to freedom. The transformation of the property had been nothing short of miraculous. Where once a weathered barn had stood on the verge of demolition, a meticulously reconstructed 1859-era structure now housed the main entrance to the historical site. Architects had worked from period photographs and Ezekiel's own detailed journals to recreate the barn exactly as it had appeared during its years as an active underground railroad station, while engineering specialists had designed an unobtrusive system to protect and preserve the underground chambers for generations to come. "Penny for your thoughts," came a familiar voice as Dr. Josephine Baker joined Eleanor at the railing. Now the center's director of historical research, Josephine had relocated to Kentucky to oversee the academic aspects of the site's development. "Just marveling at how much can change in a year," Eleanor replied, gesturing toward the property that had been transformed from a failing farm to a nationally recognized historical landmark. "Sometimes I still wake up expecting to find it was all a dream." Josephine smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "If it's a dream, we're all sharing it. Did you see the visitor numbers from last month? Over 15,000 people came to learn about what happened here. That's 15,000 people who now understand a piece of history that might have been lost forever." The statistics still astonished Eleanor. In the year since the discovery, more than 120,000 visitors had come to the Wright Freeman Center. School, groups, historical societies, civil rights organizations, and ordinary families from across the country and around the world. Each visitor departed with a deeper understanding of both the horrors of slavery and the courage of those who had fought against it, often at tremendous personal risk. "The tour bus from Chicago just arrived," Josephine noted, pointing toward the modern welcome center that had been constructed at a respectful distance from the historical structures, including descendants of 3 families who we've confirmed passed through this station. This had become one of the most meaningful aspects of the center's work, connecting descendants of freedom seekers with the physical space where their ancestors had found shelter on their perilous journey north. Using the decoded registry book and advanced genealogical research, the center had identified over 40 families with direct connections to Ezekiel Wright's underground station. "Will you join me for the welcome?" Eleanor asked, already knowing the answer. These reunions had become sacred moments for everyone involved with the center. Together, they walked the pathway toward the Welcome Center, passing the beautifully landscaped grounds where archaeological work continued to reveal additional aspects of the property's history. Just last month, a team had uncovered evidence of a sophisticated signal system that had allowed Ezekiel to communicate with neighboring sympathizers without detection, another testament to his remarkable ingenuity. Inside the Welcome Center, the Chicago group was being greeted by Amelia Wright, now the center's executive director. After completing her military service 6 months earlier, Amelia had returned to Kentucky to take on full-time leadership of the organization that preserved her ancestors' legacy. Her military background proved invaluable in managing the complex logistics of a site that had rapidly become one of the most visited historical attractions in the region. "Mom, Dr. Baker," Amelia called, waving them over. "I'd like you to meet the Johnson, Williams, and Turner families, all with ancestors who passed through this station between 1859 and 1861. The introductions that followed were deeply moving. Marcus Johnson, a Chicago attorney whose great-great-great-grandfather, William, had escaped from a Tennessee plantation. Darlene Williams, a retired teacher whose ancestor Mary had fled with her infant daughter. And James Turner, a college student researching his family history for his doctoral dissertation. "I grew up hearing stories about my ancestors' journey," Marcus Johnson explained, his voice thick with emotion. "But until your discovery, we never knew exactly where he had found shelter along the way. Now, to actually stand in the same space where he once hid." He shook his head, words failing him. Darlene Williams clutched a worn Bible that had been passed down through generations of her family. "Our oral history says that Mary was given a small scripture passage by a kind farmer who hid her and her baby daughter. We've preserved it all these years, never knowing who that farmer was." She carefully opened the Bible to reveal a yellowed slip of paper with a handwritten verse from Isaiah. "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine." Eleanor recognized the handwriting immediately from having studied Ezekiel's journals extensively over the past year. "That's Ezekiel Wright's handwriting," she confirmed gently. "He often mentioned providing scripture passages to those passing through as sources of comfort and strength for the journey ahead." Tears filled Darlene's eyes. "All these generations we've been carrying his words without knowing his name." These moments of connection had become the heart of Eleanor's new life. The financial aspects of the discovery had indeed resolved. Her immediate crisis, the National Trust's purchase of the property, had not only cleared her debts but provided her with financial security. Yet it was these human moments of healing and recognition that gave her the deepest satisfaction. After the families were escorted to begin their private tour of the underground chambers, Eleanor retreated to what had become her office in a renovated section of the farmhouse. The majority of the house remained her private residence, but she had gladly designated several rooms for the center's administrative needs. On her desk sat framed photographs that charted the extraordinary journey of the past year, the initial discovery, the first press conference with Governor Williams, the groundbreaking ceremony for the center with Amelia in her full military dress uniform, cutting the ribbon, and most poignantly, the memorial service they had held to honor both Ezekiel Wright and Rebecca Freeman, whose intertwined story had captured the nation's imagination. That particular photograph showed Eleanor and Josephine standing together beside the newly installed memorial. A sculpture depicting two hands reaching toward each other, crafted from limestone quarried from the same region where Ezekiel had built his barn. Beneath it, a simple inscription read, "For those who sought freedom and those who risked all to provide it. Their courage lights our way forward." The presidential recognition had come unexpectedly last autumn. What began as a routine acknowledgement of the site's historical significance transformed into something far more personal when the president revealed that his own wife's family tree included individuals who had likely traveled the underground railroad through Kentucky. The First Lady had visited the center privately, spending hours in the underground chambers and emerging with tears streaming down her face. "This isn't just black history or white history," she had told reporters afterward. "This is American history, the painful parts and the heroic parts, inseparable from each other. We need these places of truth-telling if we're ever to fully understand who we are as a nation." The center had since been featured in national educational programs, documentary films, and even a best-selling historical novel based on Ezekiel and Rebecca's star-crossed relationship. Historians continued to analyze the Lincoln letters, which had been carefully preserved and were now displayed in a specialized museum-quality case that traveled between the center and the National Archives on a rotating basis. A knock at her office door interrupted Eleanor's reflections. It was Thomas Blackwell from Midland Financial, now a regular visitor in his capacity as chair of the center's corporate sponsorship committee. "Mrs. Wright," he greeted her with genuine warmth that would have been unimaginable during their first tense encounters a year earlier. "I've brought the quarterly report for the endowment. I'm pleased to say we've exceeded our fundraising targets by nearly 40%. Eleanor invited him to sit, still sometimes amused by the transformation in their relationship. Midland Financial had indeed become the founding corporate sponsor of the center, contributing the first $1 million to the endowment fund established to ensure the site's perpetual maintenance and educational programming. What had begun as a reputation-saving maneuver had evolved into genuine commitment, as Blackwell himself became increasingly engaged with the center's mission. "We've also had an interesting development with the educational outreach program," Blackwell continued. 3 additional school districts have requested our curriculum materials, bringing the total to over 500 schools nationwide using the Wright-Freeman story to teach about the Underground Railroad. The educational impact of the discovery had perhaps been the most profound and far-reaching consequence. The center had worked with curriculum specialists to develop age-appropriate materials that used Ezekiel and Rebecca's story as a gateway to understanding the broader history of slavery, resistance, and the long struggle for freedom and equality in America. "That's wonderful news," Eleanor responded sincerely, especially with the new academic year approaching. After reviewing the financial details, their conversation turned to plans for the center's first anniversary celebration, scheduled for the following month. What had initially been conceived as a modest local observance had evolved into a major national event, with confirmed attendance from civil rights leaders, historians, preservation specialists, and government officials. "The governor's office called this morning," Blackwell mentioned. "They're proposing to use the anniversary to announce the creation of a statewide Underground Railroad heritage trail, with the Wright Freeman Center as its cornerstone." "Ezekiel would be astonished," Eleanor mused. "He spent his life hiding his work, and now it's becoming a tourist attraction." "Not just a tourist attraction," Blackwell corrected gently, "a place of learning, remembrance, and reconciliation." After Blackwell departed, Eleanor walked through the connecting door that led to her private residence. Though her life now involved public responsibilities she could never have imagined, she had insisted on maintaining a personal sanctuary away from the constant activity of the center. In her living room, alongside family photographs and cherished mementos, stood a specially designed display case containing the most personally meaningful artifact from the discovery, the locket containing the portraits of Ezekiel Wright and Rebecca Freeman. Though its historical significance would have justified its inclusion in the center's main exhibits, both Eleanor and Josephine had felt that this most intimate item deserved special treatment. The locket had become a symbol of the unexpected bond between their families, a tangible reminder of how history's currents had brought them together across generations and racial boundaries that would have seemed insurmountable in Ezekiel and Rebecca's time. By mutual agreement, the locket alternated between Eleanor's and Josephine's possession every 6 months, a shared custody arrangement that honored both family lines. Eleanor's phone chimed with a text message from Amelia. "Special visitor in the underground chambers, come now." Curious, Eleanor made her way through the private passage that connected her home to the historical site, without requiring her to pass through public areas. This thoughtful architectural feature had been Amelia's idea, allowing her mother to move between her private and public roles without constant interaction with visitors. As Eleanor descended the now familiar stone steps into the main underground chamber, she was surprised to find it empty of the usual tour groups. Instead, a single figure stood before the wall of handprints, an elderly man supporting himself with a carved wooden cane, his thin frame swimming somewhat in an expensive suit that suggested recent weight loss. "Senator Graham," Eleanor said, recognizing the longtime Kentucky politician whose opposition to historical preservation projects had been well documented throughout his career. "This is an unexpected honor." The senator turned slowly, his lined face solemn. At 82, he was the longest-serving member of the state legislature and a power broker whose influence extended far beyond his official position. "Mrs. Wright," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "I've been meaning to visit for some time. Figured I should do it while I still can." He gestured vaguely toward his frail physique, the implication of serious illness evident in his gaunt features. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, both of them facing the wall of handprints in silence for a moment. She had heard that the senator was ill, but had been surprised when Amelia mentioned he had requested a private visit outside regular hours. "Your family created something remarkable here," the senator finally said, his voice stronger than his appearance suggested, both then and now. "Thank you," Eleanor replied simply, sensing there was more to this visit than a sudden interest in historical preservation. The senator ran a gnarled hand over his white hair. My great-grandfather was Henry Graham. He owned a plantation about 40 miles south of here. Eleanor tensed slightly, unsure where this conversation was heading. In 1860, 3 of his most valuable slaves escaped. The senator continued, his gaze fixed on the handprints. A man named Joseph, his wife Rachel, and their son Thomas. They were never recovered. He paused, then added quietly, family legend. Says they were helped by a network of abolitionists operating in this region. Understanding dawned as Eleanor studied the elderly man's profile. You think they might have passed through here? I know they did, he replied, reaching carefully into his suit jacket to extract a folded document protected in an archival sleeve. Because I found this among my father's papers after he died. He handed her the protected document, which proved to be a yellowed letter dated October 1887. Eleanor read it with growing amazement. It was addressed to Ezekiel Wright, from a man named Thomas Freeman, writing from Ontario, Canada. I write to express my eternal gratitude for your courage and Christian charity shown to my parents and myself when we sheltered in your station in the summer of 1860. Eleanor read aloud. Though I was only a child of 7 years at the time, I remember well the kind farmer who hid us beneath his barn and gave me a small wooden horse to quiet my fears during our 3 nights in hiding. The letter continued, detailing Thomas's life in freedom, his education, his marriage, his work as a teacher, and most poignantly, his parents' passing after living more than 20 years as free people. It concluded with the request that Ezekiel destroy the letter after reading it, as Thomas feared any written evidence of Underground Railroad activities might still pose dangers in post-Reconstruction Kentucky. Ezekiel obviously didn't destroy it, Senator Graham observed. Instead, it somehow found its way into my great-grandfather's possession, then my grandfather's, then my father's. None of them ever spoke of it publicly. Eleanor carefully returned the precious document to its protective sleeve. And now you've brought it back to where it began. The senator nodded, a complex emotion crossing his lined face. My family owned their family. That's a terrible legacy to reconcile. But this letter, it's evidence that their descendants found a better path, partly because of what happened here. He gestured around the underground chamber. I've spent 50 years in politics opposing expenditures for historical preservation, arguing it was a waste of taxpayer money. I was wrong. This admission from a man known for his unwavering certainty and political intransigence carried extraordinary weight. Eleanor sensed a lifetime of reconciliation compressed into this single visit. I'd like to donate this letter to your collection, the senator continued. And I've instructed my foundation to establish a scholarship fund for descendants of those who traveled the Underground Railroad. It will be named for Joseph, Rachel, and Thomas Freeman. Moved by this unexpected act of historical reckoning, Eleanor could only nod her acceptance. The senator turned back to the wall of handprints, raising a trembling hand to hover over the impressions left by those long-ago travelers. Do you think one of these might be theirs? He asked softly. It's possible, Eleanor answered. The registry indicates a family of 3 passed through. In June 1860, Dr. Baker might be able to cross-reference with other historical records. The senator nodded, then lowered himself carefully to sit on one of the benches installed for visitors. I won't live to see the scholarship's first recipients. Pancreatic cancer, 4 months, maybe 6, the doctors say. He spoke matter-of-factly, without self-pity. But I'll die knowing I finally did something to address the moral ledger my ancestors left unbalanced. By the time Eleanor escorted Senator Graham back to the surface, Amelia was waiting with Josephine Baker, who examined the letter with professional care and personal emotion. This is extraordinary, Josephine confirmed. Thomas Freeman, the surname taken in freedom, of course, may well be connected to Isaiah and Rebecca Freeman. Many freed families settled in the same Canadian communities, often adopting similar surnames. The senator listened with evident interest before asking, "Could your research team determine if there might be living descendants of Thomas Freeman? The scholarship should go first to his family line, if they can be identified." "We'll do everything possible to trace that lineage," Josephine promised. After the senator departed, Eleanor, Amelia, and Josephine gathered in the center's research room, the letter carefully placed on the examination table. "That was unexpected," Amelia commented, still processing the encounter with the conservative politician whose support could significantly enhance the center's influence in state politics. "People can surprise you," Eleanor observed, "especially when confronted with undeniable truth." This had proven consistently true throughout the center's development. Initial skepticism or resistance from certain quarters had gradually yielded to the power of the physical evidence and the compelling human stories embedded in the discovery. The Wright Freeman Center had become a rare space of consensus in an often divided political landscape. A place where Americans of diverse backgrounds could engage with difficult history in a spirit of shared humanity. Later that evening, as sunset painted the Kentucky sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Eleanor sat on her farmhouse porch with a glass of iced tea, contemplating the extraordinary path that had led her from the brink of financial ruin to her current role as a keeper of national memory. The desperate widow facing imminent foreclosure had been transformed into a respected historical steward, her family name now synonymous with moral courage across generations. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention to Josephine and Amelia, returning from a planning meeting for the anniversary celebration. "Mind if we join you?" Josephine asked, gesturing toward the empty rocking chairs. "Always welcome," Eleanor replied warmly, watching as both women settled into the porch's comfortable seating. These impromptu evening gatherings had become a cherished ritual as the three women navigated their intertwined responsibilities to history and to each other. "Senator Graham's letter is authentic," Josephine reported, "and I've already identified potential descendants of Thomas Freeman living in Toronto. The center will contact them next week." "Another family finding their way back to this place," Amelia mused. "It's like watching history heal itself, one connection at a time." "Not healing exactly," Josephine gently corrected, "but perhaps learning to tell the truth about its scars. That's the first step toward genuine reconciliation." Eleanor considered this thoughtful distinction as she gazed out over the property that had been in her husband's family for generations. Land that had hidden extraordinary secrets beneath its ordinary appearance. The old barn that had nearly been demolished for lumber now stood as a portal to understanding, a physical reminder that history's most important chapters sometimes went unrecorded in official narratives. "Sometimes I wonder what Ezekiel would think of all this," Eleanor said. "The tours, the exhibits, the educational programs." "I think he'd be pleased," Josephine replied after a moment of reflection. "Not because of the attention to his actions, but because it means we've reached a time when the truth can be told openly. That's what he was working toward, after all, a future where freedom and equality wouldn't need to be hidden underground." Amelia nodded in agreement. "And Rebecca, too. Their story isn't just about the Underground Railroad anymore. It's about love that defied the boundaries of their time. That's why it resonates so deeply with visitors." As darkness settled over the farm, stars appearing one by one in the Kentucky sky, Eleanor felt a profound sense of rightness, not just about the center's work, but about her own unexpected journey. The bankruptcy that had seemed like an ending had instead opened a door to purpose and meaning beyond anything she could have imagined. "1 year ago today," she mused, "I was standing in that barn watching the demolition crew get ready to tear. it down if they'd started on the other end, if the storm hadn't delayed them, if any number of small circumstances had been different. But they weren't different, Amelia finished for her. Everything aligned exactly as it needed to for the truth to emerge when we were ready to receive it. Eleanor thought about the thousands of visitors who had stood in the underground chambers, bearing witness to both the darkest and most inspiring aspects of American history. She thought about the families reconnected to their ancestors' journeys, the students whose understanding of the past had been transformed, and even Senator Graham finding a measure of peace in confronting his family's complicated legacy. "From bankruptcy to this," she said softly, "who could have imagined?" "That's the thing about tearing down old structures," Josephine observed with gentle wisdom. "Sometimes you discover foundations you never knew were there, foundations strong enough to build something entirely new." As they sat together in companionable silence, Eleanor realized that the most valuable discovery beneath the old barn hadn't been the Lincoln letters or historical artifacts, significant as they were. The true treasure had been the revelation of interconnected lives and moral choices that spanned generations, a legacy not of property or possessions, but of courage, compassion, and the enduring human capacity to recognize our shared humanity even in history's darkest hours. The bankruptcy that had threatened to end her story had instead been merely the beginning of a far more meaningful chapter, not just for Eleanor Wright, but for all those whose lives had been touched by what lay hidden beneath the old barn, waiting patiently for its truth to finally emerge into the light. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.